All right. So, have you ever wondered, like, how American higher education, went from being something only for the elite few to, like, what we have today? It's a pretty crazy story.
Yeah.
And we're going to take a deep dive into that transformation in this episode.
Sounds good.
We're talking late 19th, early 20th century, a time of incredible change, not just for universities, but for, like, all of American society.
Right.
And we've got some excerpts from students' research paper to guide us through it all. They've dug up some really interesting sources. A book by John Thielen on the evolution of universities.
Okay.
A document from something called the Committee of 10, which sounds a little ominous.
Yeah, a little bit.
And an article on the rise of progressivism in education. So we've got a lot to cover. But first things first. Imagine a time when universities were kind of like the hot new startups of their day.
Interesting.
All these institutions competing for students for prestige.
Sure.
And, of course, for funding.
Yeah.
Big time.
Yeah, big investments were being made.
Huge investments, right?
Yeah.
Like, we're talking major players like the Rockefellers and the Carnegies. These titans of industry were pouring money into shaping higher education.
They were.
It makes you wonder, though. Were they just feeling generous? Or did they have their own agendas, their own visions for what a university should be?
It's a good question. And you can definitely see how those donations directly shaped the development of these universities.
Oh, absolutely.
Take Andrew Carnegie, for instance. His passion for libraries led to this huge boom in library construction on campuses all over the country.
Oh.
Suddenly, access to knowledge, these vast collections of books became like a defining feature of going to university.
It's true. And it wasn't just buildings either, right?
No, not at all.
This era saw the rise of all these professional schools, like law, medicine, engineering, you name it.
It was a real shift.
It's like universities were finally catching up with the changing demands of, like, the real world.
Absolutely. This was a time of rapid industrialization. You had tons of immigrants coming to America. A whole new middle class was emerging, and they needed skills to succeed in this new landscape.
Right.
So universities had to adapt. It wasn't enough to just produce these well-rounded intellectuals anymore.
Interesting.
They needed to give people the actual tools to, like, build the railroads, to design skyscrapers, to navigate this increasingly complex society.
It was a whole new ballgame.
It was.
So we've got these universities, right, changing so fast, but what about, like, the education system that's supposed to prepare students for them?
Right.
That's where this Committee of 10 comes in.
Yeah.
It sounds kind of secretive,
A little bit, yeah, like a spy thriller or something.
No, it was actually a group of educators trying to figure out this massive problem, how to standardize American education.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about getting more kids into college, though that was part of it. They really wanted to make sure everyone, all citizens, had the skills to make sense of this rapidly changing world, the Industrial Revolution, all that.
And what's cool is our student actually found part of the original report from this committee.
Oh, wow. A primary source.
Yeah, and you can tell they really cared about this stuff. Like, they debated everything. Which subjects to teach, how much homework was too much.
Passionate debates about homework. Gotta love those.
Right. But, thinking back then, education was, for the most part, a privilege, right? If you weren't wealthy.
It's true. Not a lot of options back then if you weren't from the right family.
But these committee folks, they were pushing for something different.
They were a more merit-based system. One where how well you did in school mattered more than your background, your family's money, all that.
So that's where standardized testing comes from, to make things fair.
In a way, yes. It all started with this idea that there needed to be a way to measure what students were learning, no matter where they were learning it.
Makes sense, right? You need some kind of common yardstick.
Exactly.
Of course, standardized tests, they've got their issues.
Yeah, no argument there.
A lot of people criticize them, and for good reasons, but it's interesting to think that it all came from this desire to make education more equal.
It's a complicated legacy for sure. The Committee of 10 had a huge impact. But like any big change, there were unintended consequences too.
Like what?
Well, critics at the time, they argued that this big push for uniformity, for everyone learning the same things, it could actually stifle creativity.
I see what you mean.
And it probably put certain types of learners at a disadvantage, the ones who didn't fit neatly into those boxes.
So maybe in trying to level the playing field, they might have actually limited some students?
That's the question, isn't it? And it's something we're still wrestling with today, this balance between giving everyone the same foundation and allowing for individual strength and passions to flourish.
Wow, so much to think about. It's kind of amazing, though, that a group of educators over 100 years ago could have such a lasting impact.
Absolutely. Their fingerprints are all over the education system we have today, the good and the, well, the not so good. But that's a conversation for another time, perhaps.
So, okay, we've gone from these elite colleges to this big push for standardized education, right, for everyone.
Right.
But it doesn't end there, not even close.
No, not at all.
As we move into the early 20th century, there's this whole new debate that starts heating up.
Yeah.
And this one really gets to the heart of, like, what's the point of education in the first place, you know?
Yeah, this is a big one. This is where we see the rise of what our student calls the progressives.
Okay, progressives.
And, before you start picturing protests and marches and all that.
Right, not that kind of progressive.
Exactly. This is about education. These were teachers, thinkers, people who really believed that the education system needed a serious shakeup.
To keep up with the times.
Exactly, to keep up with the times, to create a more modern, more democratic society.
I like it.
But here's the thing. They didn't all agree on what that shakeup should look like.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there were actually some pretty big divisions within this progressive movement.
Interesting.
Our student found this great article by historian David Laborie. And Laborie, he argues that there were basically two main camps, each with their own vision for the future of education. The administrative progressives and the pedagogical progressives.
Okay, two types of progressives.
Two very different types.
So let's break it down. On the one hand, we've got these administrative progressives.
Right.
What was their deal?
For them, efficiency was key. They wanted a system that ran like a well-oiled machine,
Okay.
standardized, streamlined, designed to produce productive members of society.
Interesting.
Think vocational training, standardized tests to track progress, a whole package.
So it's kind of like an extension of what the Committee of 10 was pushing for.
Yeah, there are definitely some parallels there.
Makes sense.
And this approach, it was really appealing to a lot of business leaders and politicians at the time.
Why is that?
Well, it promised a workforce that was ready to go, equipped with the specific skills needed to fuel this booming industrial economy.
Right, practical skills, that's what they needed.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's the administrative side.
Right.
But then you've got these pedagogical progressives.
Right.
And they weren't so gung-ho about this whole education as factory model,
Sure.
right?
Not so much. Their approach was much more about the individual child. It was inspired by the ideas of this guy, John Dewey.
Ah, John Dewey. Now, there's a name that's synonymous with progressive education, right?
Exactly.
Wasn't he all about hands-on learning, letting kids explore and figure things out for themselves?
That was Dewey, absolutely. He thought education shouldn't just be about memorizing facts and dates. It should be about critical thinking, problem solving, fostering a genuine love of learning for its own sake.
So you've got this real clash of ideologies here.
For sure.
On the one hand, we've got practical skills, workforce readiness.
Right.
On the other hand, we've got nurturing the whole child, their curiosity, their creativity.
And what's really interesting is that both sides actually had a real impact. For a while, at least.
Oh, yeah.
You had these experimental schools popping up all over the country, some based on the administrative model, others following Dewey's lead.
A real educational experiment.
It was. But in the end, as Laborie points out, it was the administrative progressives who won out.
Really? Why do you think their vision ended up winning?
Well, a few reasons. First, it just fit better with what was happening in the world at the time.
Yeah.
Industrialization was exploding. There was this huge demand for workers with specialized skills.
So focusing on vocational training, that just made sense in that context.
It did. And it probably seemed more efficient, more results-oriented.
Right.
But here's the irony, and it's something our student picks up on in their paper. While the administrative approach may have won the day in terms of policy and practice,
Yeah.
the pedagogical progressives, they didn't vanish entirely.
Oh, where'd they go?
They retreated, you could say, to schools of education.
You're kidding. So the very institutions responsible for training future teachers, they were steeped in Dewey's philosophy.
It's true. Even as schools themselves were becoming more standardized, more focused on vocational skills, the people teaching in those schools were being taught something very different.
Wow, that's fascinating. It's like this weird paradox.
It is, and it helps explain why we're still having these same debates today, over 100 years later.
It's true. Are we prioritizing standardized tests too much? Are we really encouraging critical thinking or just teaching to the test? It's something we grapple with all the time.
We do, and it all goes back to this fundamental tension between different visions of what education should be.
Wow, this deep dive has been quite the journey. We've covered so much ground, from those early elite colleges to this push for mass education.
Yeah.
From the standardization movement to the rise of the progressives.
A lot happened.
It's amazing to see how all these historical forces we've talked about are still shaping education today.
They really are.
And, it makes you wonder, have we maybe gone too far in emphasizing the vocational aspects of education?
It's a good question to ask ourselves.
Have we found the right balance between giving students practical skills and nurturing a love of learning for its own sake?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is. And on that note, deep divers, we're going to leave you with one final thought to ponder.
Always.
As you go about your day, think about your own educational journey. What kind of student were you? What kind of learning did you connect with the most? And most importantly, what kind of education do we want for the generations that come after us? Food for thought, deep divers. Until next time.
In this analysis, I will discuss how American education dramatically changed between the years of 1890 and 1910, and even thereafter, by reviewing one chapter and two different articles on the subject. The chapter by John R. Thalen, entitled Captains of Industry and Erudition, 1880 to 1910, discusses many of the changes of this time in higher education. The first article by Charles Eliot, entitled Report of the Committee of 10, is a report of how educators, in an effort to improve the overall education of American citizens, whether they attended college or not, created an improved uniform system of pre-college education nationwide. And lastly, the second article by David F. Laborie, entitled Progressivism, Schools and Schools of Education, An American Romance, is an analysis of how two different forms of progressivism in secondary education have fought for control since the early 20th century, with the administrative progressives in the lead at the schools and the pedagogical progressives in the lead of the schools of education. These analyses will enable me to better understand the changes that occurred in American higher education between 1890 and 1910, and how they helped create the university of today. Higher education changed dramatically in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In Thalen's chapter entitled Captains of Industry and Erudition, 1880 to 1910, he writes about the changes which occurred in higher education between the years of 1880 and 1910 with the intention of expressing a theme of the time. The theme of the chapter, in my opinion, is that there were many different kinds of changes in higher education during this time. These changes were improvements to higher education overall. There were many people and organizations, both in and out of education, who exercised these improvements. For example, some improvements were monetary. There were a number of wealthy people who donated millions of dollars to the universities of their choice, specifically with the intention of doing a greater good for society, or just for their egos. Also, some of these improvements were political. Programs were being introduced into higher education, which enabled minorities and women to attend college. While these new students were limited in what they were allowed to study and where they were allowed to study, it was a tremendously modern leap in American culture, which encouraged the children of former slaves to earn a college degree. Universities were prospering, and not just because of the people from outside the universities, but also because of the people within them. Campus presidents were coming up with new ways to stabilize their universities. Some of them were just very good at getting the donations their schools needed, but others were also very good at expanding their schools' programs and increasing their profits by creating degree programs in the new professions, which were considered more useful in the new industrial times. A diversity of events occurred in higher education during this time, which brought on change for the better at the university. The Committee of 10 Educators organized in the late 19th century to change the standards of American pre-college education forever. In Charles Eliot's article entitled Report of the Committee of 10, he gives an explanation of how 9 conferences were conducted by 69 appointed educators with the intention of creating a standardized secondary educational system, which would enable them to ensure that all American citizens would have an education adequate enough to make them useful members of society, and if they chose to, be successful college students as well. These educators discussed not only what subjects would be taught, but when in a student's life they would be taught and on what kind of a schedule on which they would be taught. Through this 6-week process, they also were able to establish standardized requirements within secondary education for enrolling into college. It was believed that the purpose of secondary education was not to prepare students for college, since so few citizens continued on to college. It was argued by many that too many students were ill-prepared for the rigors of a college education by the time they attended, and that more college students would succeed in college if these standards were established as well. As a result, they established these standards as well. Also, with these elevated standards being established, it became obvious that the standards for training teachers needed to be improved upon so that teachers could meet the requirements set by this new system. But this system was not to be set in stone, since it was believed that there was always room for improvement. Eliot himself even wrote in the report that this work would require further attention throughout the future. This educational system has continued to be improved upon since then. In the first decade of the 20th century, two different groups of educators were developing their different arguments for progressive education, which would wage a war in American education until today. In his article entitled Progressivism, Schools and Schools of Education, An American Romance, David F. Laborie explains how the administrative progressives gained control of the secondary educational system by taking an already curriculum-based system of education and converting it into an even more utilitarian system of education, which teaches children in a vocational environment to conform to society's need for productive, skilled employees. This group promoted a test-oriented system which required teachers to teach for the test rather than for the sake of learning. The opposition to this group was the pedagogical progressive group, which preached child-centered learning and encouraged children to learn for the sake of learning in what they considered to be a more natural form of education, as was written about by John Dewey, who studied this subject between 1896 and 1904. While both groups were extremists, one group was already in the right place at the right time and already leaned closer to what was the current system of education. The administrative progressives had created a subverted political system within the school system, allowing them more control over the governance of the secondary school system and, in the long run, influence over universities, colleges of education. Their arguments for reform were more appealing to politicians and employers because they required less expensive reform, which, at the same time, encouraged the production of more useful employees for society. Pedagogical progressives, on the other hand, required almost complete reform to the secondary school system, which encouraged a method of teaching that was not as easily measured or controlled. Of course, the administrative progressives won this war, and their methods were even standardized within the schools of education at the university level, but their adversaries are not dead. The irony here, according to Laborie, is that the pedagogical progressives of today are mostly the school teachers and the professors who taught them. Today, professors of education often refer to Dewey's theories of education when conducting their lessons. School teachers sometimes apply Dewey's methods to their classroom teachings, and even administration will encourage these methods on a small scale. And while some private schools have gone so far as to teach entirely by Dewey's system, none have been known to stick with it for long. I can only guess why. Maybe it's because of lack of funding or cooperation from the local government. But today, both secondary and higher education systems continue to lean towards a more utilitarian vocational system of education, which is curriculum-based and test-oriented, while child-based learning at the university is only spoken of romantically. In this analysis, I have discussed how secondary and higher education in America has changed dramatically during the years of 1890, continuing on to 1910, and even thereafter. John R. Thalen wrote in Captains of Industry and Erudition, 1880 to 1910, about how there were many different kinds of changes for the better in higher education, which caused the university to flourish. In the first article by Charles Eliot, Report of the Committee of 10, he reported on how 69 educators appointed by a committee of 10 higher educators held 9 conferences in an effort to improve the overall education of American citizens and increasing their chances of succeeding in college by creating an improved uniform system of pre-college education nationwide. And David F. Laborie wrote in Progressivism, Schools and Schools of Education, An American Romance, about how 2 different forms of progressivism in secondary education fought for control since the first decade of the 20th century, with the administrative progressives winning and leaving the pedagogical progressives to only talk about their perspectives within the schools of education. While I do have a better understanding of how the university has gotten to this point today, I am now conflicted over the argument for the vocational-based education. I have always been a fan of it because it has taught me skills which have enabled me to succeed in a society which does not support the learning of the classics. And I am taken aback because during my youth I studied and performed Shakespeare, copied the style of Rockwell and Frazetta, read the works of London, Orwell, and Tolkien. I listened to Puccini, Tchaikovsky, and even sang Mozart's operas on stage. But I have to ask myself if I've conformed too much for the sake of my useful education from the University of the 21st century. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you got something out of it. It's designed for instructional designers as well as online educators, as are many of the other videos on this channel. So if you're not into that, you may have found it a little boring. And if you didn't, then great. Subscribe for more. And we'll see you next time.